Fish are friends, not food.
I'm a little worried about Rob.
Yes, it's happening.
Ever since we tried to summon Cthulhu, he hasn't been the same.
I'm growing gills. Gills! My transformation into a deep one has finally begun.
Rob, we don't see any gills.
It's these kids getting involved in all this stuff causes them to go crazy.
I think I feel the webbing starting to grow between my fingers.
Welcome to Dinner and a Board Game, a new actual play show about friends, good food, and lots of fun at the gaming table. We're your hosts, Megan and Heath. Each night, I'll invite the gaming group over to my house to cook dinner, sample drinks, and play a board game on one of our customized board game boards. Dinner and a Board Game is an actual play show where you'll be able to watch the game from start to finish, with gameplay dashboards and graphics that help track the turns and allow everyone to follow the game's action. We'll play games like Zombicide, Black Plague, Descent, Journeys in the Dark, Small World, Unearth, and Terraforming Mars. We'll even be joined by special guests such as Lou Anders, J.F. Lewis, and cosmic horror artist David LaRocca. The show is free to watch on YouTube. Just come by my channel, Heath Robinson, and be sure to subscribe. Click Watch Now to start the first episode and join us for fun-filled evenings of dinner and a board game. And now it's time for Table Talk, where we'll be talking about the creative and business side of making things in the tabletop and fantasy genre. Let's get to it. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 12 of Table Talk. It's kind of crazy. This is already episode 12 ever since I decided that I kind of got this wild hair, and I decided, you know what, I should really start live streaming. And so I created these two shows, Table Talk and General Geekdom, and, well, here we are, and it seems to be going well. So tonight's special guest is Kamran Pasha, and he actually has the distinction of being the first person who has been a guest on the show twice, because we had great technical difficulties last time, like on episode 8 or something about that, maybe 2 weeks ago or something like that. We weren't able to finish our conversation. My whole power went out. So what we're going to do is we're going to continue our conversation from last time. We're not going to go over all of the stuff that we talked about on the last episode where he was here. So I highly recommend, if you're interested in what we're talking about, also go back and watch what we talked about in the previous episode. We're going to do a brief recap to figure out where we were, and then we're going to go forward from here. He is a writer and producer out in Hollywood. If you check his IMDb, he's got Sleeper Cell, Kings, Nikita, Roswell, New Mexico. He is also a novelist. He's got 2 different novels, one on the Crusades about King Richard and Saladin. I was listening about that, and I really need to read that one because I like the Crusades. And also he was talking about how, it kind of ties in with not officially, but, the kind of era that Kingdom of Heaven is. And I loved that movie. That's Shadow of the Swords. And he also has Mother of the Believers, a novel of the birth of Islam. And of course, you probably know him elsewhere on YouTube. He is all over the place on YouTube. Welcome, Kamran. Well, you're muted.
So we start
There
off
you
with more technical stuff to continue to honor our tradition of our last effort at this. But thank you for bringing me back on. It was a very interesting thing where essentially I lost power and then I came back and then you lost power and I essentially ran the video without the host for
he can. Cameron's multi-talented. He can do anything when required. You put him on a YouTube stream. So
look, I hope to be able, if those who stuck around last time and those who are going to watch this afterwards, I hope to be able to get into the meat of the things that we wanted to talk about last time. And I think it'll be exciting stuff.
Because that was just what we were about. I mean, we were just starting that when it all went out. Yep. I do want to, you are pitching as further intros. You're pitching 2 shows right now out in Hollywood for everybody. So they also know that you're actively working out there.
Oh yeah, Well, more than pitching, I've got some major projects moving forward. So I don't want to go into the details of that until we're ready to announce them. So
but all of that's happening. So okay, we had just been talking about in the last episode Christian, Jewish, Muslim mythology. And as a basis, or at least what I saw was a lack of utilization of that in fantasy storytelling. Now, you had brought up that there was the great era of biblical epics, that we talk about, and I think that's very true. It's not quite exactly what I was thinking of when I was thinking of that, because when I think of fantasy, with a classic fantasy, elves, dwarves, but also we draw a lot from Greek fantasy. I don't think of, when we're just creating fantasy worlds or creating fantasy, I don't think of things that are drawn from Christianity,
But that's
Islam.
interesting here, because that's a cultural bias, right? Because
Yeah.
look, anyone who knows me knows I'm a practicing Muslim, right? I mean, so I'm
Right,
within a
right.
culture and I'm seeing it from within, but I'm also a writer, so I have to step outside and look at it. So that's a cultural bias that we all have, is that the stories that were raised within our tradition, even if we're not believers, but they're the part of our cultural tradition, we don't even think of them as fantasy. They're just part of our tradition, right? And so is Santa Claus a fantasy story, right? It's we don't think of it that way, but it's a story with magical stories, magic flying reindeer and all this other stuff, and Frosty the Snowman. All those things are stories in our culture, but we don't think of them as fantasy stories, even though they're essentially they're as made up as Lord of the Rings. In fact, they're more made up than Lord of the Rings, which is based on biblical storytelling. But we look at the Bible. If I am not Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, if I am from another tradition, culturally, if I'm Hindu, I'm Buddhist, and I'm not raised with this kind of archetypal stories of Moses and Jesus and all this stuff floating around, it's new to me when I'm introduced to it. And if I'm not a believer within the tradition, you got stories of, this little boy, the Moses story is the ultimate archetypal fantasy story, right? If you're outside of the tradition, you're looking at it, it's a little boy, he was cast away in this little basket because his mom's trying to save his life, and he's adopted by the Pharaoh, and then he ends up killing somebody and goes off into the desert, and a bush starts talking to him, and all these magical things start happening. A staff turns into a snake. The waters open up so he can lead his people through. I mean, that's as epic as anything that J.R.R. Tolkien has written, or George R.R. Martin, right? But because we're within the cultural tradition, we don't see it as fantasy, especially if we are, like myself, a believer. So the stories are not. When we use the word mythology, we're not saying it's not true. So anyone who's watching is like, you're talking about Jewish, Christian, Muslim mythology. Mythology just means meaningful story. It's not just a story, but a story that has profound personal meaning. I mean, I think Lord of the Rings is a mythology. It's presented, especially the Silmarillion, is presented events that actually happened in an alternative past, right? But it doesn't matter. If it's meaningful to you, it becomes mythology. It doesn't mean it's not true. And so this thing of our biblical tradition, of which I include the Quran is part of the biblical tradition of stories. And for somebody outside of it, it sounds fantastical. It sounds like fantasy, right? You've got winged beings of light flowing in, and you've got, in the Bible, you got these Nephilim giants running around, and you got all these creatures. And in Islam, you got these jinn who are,
Right.
And in Western culture, that is portrayed as fantasy. The genie that comes out of the bottle. That's not fantasy to Muslims. We believe it's part of our religion. We believe that there's this parallel race, interdimensional race living amongst us. And yet it is fantasy. The Sinbad stories, Aladdin stories. It's fantasy.
Yeah, the 40 Arabian Nights. Yeah, that's true. That it does draw upon Muslim or Islam as a fantasy. Now, I would say that's not as mainstream. Like as far as because Lord of the Rings and orcs and elves and things like that are much more mainstream.
But
right now. But you're right. That's a very strong
we
tradition.
Think of the flying carpet and all those archetypal images as fantasy, because they, what fantasy is something that's outside of our culture. And, and that's why Aladdin and his lamp is still fantasy storytelling to the West. To the Muslims, it is magical storytelling, but it comes out of our culture. So I don't know that we would consider it fantasy, because I believe in jinn. I believe there are these spirit beings amongst us. And so it's not fantasy to me, but it's fantasy to somebody outside the tradition.
Well, now an exception that kind of proves the rule would be Mrs. Marvel. Like recently, we had that show that dealt with the jinn, so that was one that was drawing. I would say Mrs. Marvel, the Marvel universe, fantasy universe. But that's one that did draw from that we have jinn being one of the main creatures. And so
it's the first time you had an expression of this idea. Outside of the sort of Western stereotype of the genie in the lamp, right? That this is actually part of people's belief system. For a quarter of the planet believes that these entities live amongst us in a parallel dimension, and that show explored that.
Yes, but I think that's kind of like the exception proves the rule in a sense that we get that, not just the one.
Well,
of the ones that
because fantasy storytelling, superheroes, another form of fantasy storytelling.
Yeah.
One could argue that superheroes are just the modern Greek and Norse myths come to life with new, and literally in the form of Thor. They are the
Thor is exactly right. Yeah.
But I mean, one would argue that modern superheroes, Superman, Batman, all of the great superheroes that were invented in the 20th century comics are just a continuation of the kind of archetypal storytelling that Homer did.
Okay, so on this channel, I've done a series of videos on the philosophy of orcishness, and I suppose in some ways you can't get much more geeky than that as far as diving into orcishness and figuring it out. But I actually think that it has some important things to say about what we discuss as a society and fantasy. And I think that you may have some important insight into that. So one of the first things that I did, and this is on the channel and so on playlist, where I went through and I documented the history of the development of orcs from pre-Tolkien all the way through Tolkien and then up until the present day.
And Tolkien changed and evolved how he understood them in his own writings. So yeah.
Yes, as far as I was able to find within his own writing, yes, they changed and evolved. Yes, but you've got the Celtic tradition, which there isn't that I was able to find.
Where does the word come from? I'm not familiar with the origin of the word pre-Tolkien. What is the historical?
It actually comes from the word, if I can remember from what I had put in all of these videos. I was looking for a connection between orc and the demonic, and it's actually extremely direct linguistically. That you've got orc, you've got orcus, this word that's associated with the underworld, and so in also, I believe it's Beowulf, you have the direct connection between this word orc and its translation later as demon. So you've got
orc coming into Norwegian, Scandinavian storytelling in Beowulf 1,000 years ago.
Right. Okay. And this was a word that was adopted and brought in by Tolkien, and it became his orcs. And then now it's become everything else that it has become. And, from World of Warcraft and all of this. And one of the things, when I was done writing this, like this history of orcishness and trying to understand orcs, like, for instance, from Demon, like we were just talking about, all the way through, there was this this thing that happened in Dungeons and Dragons rather recently that their alignment as evil had been removed. That they're no longer something.
Are they neutral?
Right. Well, the statement is something like this, and this is not an exact quote, but very close. That they removed any type of like racial evilness from the orcs by saying that they are just as capable of choosing their own paths as anybody else. They're good and evil just as humans are.
Which is interesting because that's how Muslims see the jinn, by the way. We see the jinn as the parallel people often say is jinn are like the demons of Christianity. They're not, because there can be demonic jinn. There can be jinn that are evil and malevolent, and there are jinn that are good and they worship God and they do righteousness, right? The range of free will exists within that entity and that tradition, right? Whereas I think most Christians consider you're either an angel or demon, or you've made that choice and you went from angel to demon. So what's interesting that you say that, Heath, is my own, and you probably have much more knowledge because you looked into it, my own understanding of the orc evil conundrum out of Tolkien is I've read some scholarly articles about the Silmarillion, whatever, before sort of the postmodern scholarship on Tolkien, the traditional scholarship, looking at his material rather than projecting onto it political ideologies that have come later. But if some of the early scholarship was talking about the nature of, did Tolkien believe the orcs had free will? Now we understand as the mythology developed that eventually Tolkien identified the orcs as descendants of corrupted elves. They were elves that were stolen by Morgoth, the force of evil, the Satan in his world, of whom Sauron is just a servant, and were taken and were tortured and were abused psychologically, physically, and turned almost into animals, and then forced to breed with each other, like in a breeding experiment. And then the orcs are essentially these devolved form of elves. That's the mythology as I understand it. And I read one scholar suggested that Tolkien believed that the environment in which these orcs were incubated and forcibly bred, right, and multiple generations of the abuse, the cycle of abuse, because they're physically bred in this environment, they almost like animals, they can't escape it, that their elven and their, you know, inherent conscience has been suppressed, just like any abused child. If you're living in a system where you're being raised like an animal and the whole system is that, your humanity is stripped away early on, and then you are dehumanized. But that the idea is that Tolkien believed that in theory, an orc could break free of that, but it's very, and reestablish their Eru created. Eru is the god of the, you know, of the Tolkien world. Eru and Iluvatar, the Eru created nature that the elves were given. He could return to that, an orc could return to that, but it's really, really hard because they've essentially been beaten, tortured, and brainwashed and treated like animals from birth. So it's extremely hard to break free, but it's possible. That's my understanding from that scholar's article. I don't know that how that jives with what you've learned.
Well, and I think that is one of the things that does change within Tolkien itself, like his attitude exactly toward the orcs. There is some shifting throughout the decades and the writing, you know.
Okay.
But so what I was trying to get at, or what I realized as I was writing this, is that, okay, if we start off with this idea of the orc as demon, and then we end up with this idea today as an orc as, let's use the term person. Okay. Is, you know, obviously in today's world, we are hyper aware of making sure that something like an orc in a story doesn't stereotype some particular race or culture or something.
Because we're projecting human ethnic issues onto this fantasy creation. Yes.
And we're very aware of that. And so we don't want to do that. Now, but I suppose that my concern with that is that that's what we talk about when we talk about orcishness. It seems like when I was talking to other authors about that. But I was actually more interested in what that says about our society's relationship with the demonic, because it seems like we have progressed the orc. So, you know, it's very important, if you believe in demons or the demonic, that you wouldn't ever want to demonize a human. You know, that humans and demons are different from one another. You don't want to
ontologically, and with regard to the origin story of demons being fallen angels, that they made one choice. You know, human beings have free will every second of the way, right? I don't know whether in Christian theology a demon can repent. I don't generally hear that concept.
It seems like no, from the people who
seems like it's once you made the choice to go down this path, it forever will dominate your destiny, like the Sith.
But that as a human, the choice is still there.
Yeah,
so
you can repent every moment.
Never want to
change any moment you want.
A human as something demonic, because the human can change.
Correct, because the human has the ability to regain, to regain the light, to regain relationship with God at any moment. Yes.
Whereas ontologically, a demon would not. So you wouldn't want to demonize humans, you know. And we hear that even sort of just today. Don't demonize that person or something like that. But you know, if you think about actually what you're talking about, you know, if you believe in demons, if you have it, or even if you don't, you know, what the demonic means, you don't want to demonize people. But I think that the reverse would also be true, that if you're not supposed to demonize humans, you wouldn't want to humanize demons, that you wouldn't want to humanize the demonic. And so if the orc was a representation of the demonic, and that is something about our attitude toward how, or, you know, something that tells us what our attitude toward the demonic should be, which is typically a combative attitude, it seems. If you're a hero, because it's not easy to be combative towards something demonic. But somebody like Aragorn, or, you know, other great heroes, one of the reasons they're heroes is because they can be combative toward demons. And, you know, so they don't want to humanize the demon. Like, what do you do with the demon? You don't make it a sandwich. You know,
well, you can try to. I mean, there's horror movies where the person thinks he can reach the demon, and the demon just destroys.
That was not the correct response to the demon.
Yeah, they'll always betray you, kind of thing. Yes.
So I was wondering, as I read, going from orc, all, you know, through people playing orcs in games and in World of Warcraft and stuff like that, as we have we actually humanized the demonic? And does that say something about what we think about evil as a society?
Well, that definitely says what we think about evil society. We're again a moment in culture where there is, you know, there is this and there's value to it and there's challenges to it. Where the idea is don't generalize, which I think is a fair statement amongst human beings. We've gone through historical periods of fighting the other, and my Crusades novel is all about that, about the Crusaders projecting all their sort of worst instincts onto their Muslim adversaries and then actually encountering them and realizing that their understanding was just false. I mean, and that's more demoralizing than losing a battle, is that when you're fighting people like, when the Crusaders encountered Saladin, who they've been told is this evil, infidel tyrant, and he turns out to be this incredibly chivalrous, noble man by their moral standards of chivalry. He's exceeding the chivalry that Richard the Lionheart is showing, who's killing women and children left and right, and Saladin is sending them presents in the middle of battle. Like in the middle of a battle, he would there was a wedding party happening in one of the Crusader camp while Saladin attacked, and in the middle of the battle, he sent presents over to the wedding party and kept fighting, right? But that just came from his inherent nature of his chivalry, which is part of Islamic culture. It's called futua, this kind of chivalry. There's a word for it, and that shattered that kind of dealing with an adversary that was noble by their moral standards and discovering that their projections onto their adversary were false, demoralized the Crusaders more than anything else. It wasn't defeat in physical battle. It was just, who are we fighting, right? My novel goes into that. I mean, are we the bad guys in the story? And that's the most demoralizing moment. So I think all that is healthy in dealing with human beings. So now we're looking at these mythological creations, right, that serve a purpose in story. There is, to my knowledge, there is nothing in Tolkien, including in anything of his notes, of any orc that turned good. I don't know of any unpublished short story of the good orc that broke free. I don't think that exists, unless someone has undiscovered notes from Christopher Tolkien or whatever. I don't know. But he did, and he was also writing from a time period, where he did see the world as black and white. He came from, a British Christian background, and he had very strict things at the East, those Orientalist projections, the East is, the Easterlings were evil. But even then, even in his novels, even in The Lord of the Rings, he acknowledges that the Easterlings who were fighting for Sauron had been lied to. So they weren't inherently evil.
And they were different. They were distinguished between them and the orcs. Again, that was, correct. If the orcs are the demonic.
Correct.
Yeah.
Where's the orcs? So here's my thought on the orcs. So part of the problem of in reinterpreting this mythology, which has no basis in the source material, to give these orcs this free will, it's our value judgment about their behavior that makes it uncomfortable. If we thought of orcs as a colony of bees or ants or other insects, they behave in ways that, some fire ants can be very physically dangerous human beings, can kill them, right? And have no problem doing so. And is that evil? Or they're just doing what is inherently programmed into them within their nature? We watch a movie like Them, a classic movie from the 50s, one of my favorite movies from that era of like the nuclear Godzilla, and you have these, nuclear testing creates giant ants. Are the giant ants evil? They're definitely scary, and they're a threat to human beings, and they have to be destroyed. Are they evil? I don't know that they're evil. They're following their natural instincts as evolved creatures to survive and to eat. One would say that the orcs are exactly the same, right? And so projecting onto them our concept of free will, does an ant have free will? Does a bee have free will? I mean, they have a hive mind, and is that immoral? Yeah, they have an instinct. And is that immoral? It can be dangerous. You have to destroy something that's a physical threat to you. But is it evil? I hate insects. I hate cockroaches in particular. I'm scared the hell out of them. Are they evil? They certainly feel like it to me when they come into my home, right? They're not evil. The spiders, they're not evil. They're following their instinct, which just happens to be you're the victim of that instinct. And so you got to defend yourself. And that is, I think, the more accurate way to think of these creatures, especially the orcs who are a bred race. They're not like Morgoth and the fallen Ainur, the sort of angelic beings that Morgoth led a rebellion against Eru the Crater, and Sauron and all these dark figures, followed him and took physical form. But they're essentially they're closer to demons because they made a choice. Whereas the orcs never had a choice. They're just following a programmed instinct that is a threat to the human race. But
that's interesting that demonic, you're associating that in order to be demonic, you need to have made the choice. That's something that does not have a choice.
Made a choice. Orcs never had a choice. And it's not in Tolkien's mythology, to my knowledge, the orcs ever had a choice. I mean, they didn't ask to be their ancestors didn't ask to be kidnapped elves from the woods, taken in and brutalized and horrifically tortured and scarred and physically changed with God knows what chemicals, and then forced to breed with each other like animals. They didn't ask for that, but that's what they got. And their kids didn't ask to be born that way, deformed and abused. But that's what they got, and they're now instinct. They're not evil, but they're a threat. They're an absolute threat that has to be stopped. A virus is not evil. A virus is just doing what it does, but it has to be stopped, as we've been through the last 2 years, or we're in trouble.
Well, that is an interesting, a very interesting take, I think, on the orcs. That if they don't have choice, which actually does come back to things like Satan and the fallen angels and things like that theologically, which I hope we will be able to get to. Let me ask you: does traditionally with Christianity, especially here where I am in the South, we have this antagonistic relationship between evangelical Christianity and Dungeons and Dragons and role playing. Is there
sure because they view it as a kind of exalting magic, which they think is sinful?
Does Islam, and it's extremely broadly, or the sections of Islam have that same kind of relationship with Dungeons and Dragons or role playing in general, or is it just something that it may not be something that really has come up?
It hasn't come up. I mean, look, I played role playing games. I played Dungeons and Dragons as a kid. And I was raised in a religious Muslim household. It's never an issue. I think it is a uniquely American evangelical issue. Look, in all of our traditions, evil magic, black magic is a bad thing, right? The Quran talks about it. The Quran acknowledges the existence of magic, that it's a real phenomenon in the universe. It's called sihr, which means magic, and it actually gives an origin story for magic. The Quranic story, and this is a fantasy story if you're not a believer, but it's a story, right? The Quranic story is that magic was first taught to human beings by two angels in ancient Babylon that were essentially fallen angels called Harut and Marut. Were very interesting figures, because Islam doesn't really have a concept of fallen angels. Christianity has angels that fell and rebelled against God and became demons. In most Muslims would say that angels don't have any free will. Right. They are just almost robotically fulfilling God's will. So there's no free will to rebel. Whereas the jinn, which are an invisible race between angel and human, does have free will. And the general Islamic position is that Satan was of the jinn, and that's why he could rebel against God, right? But he's not an angel. But in the Quran, there is this strange story of these two angels that are essentially teaching people black magic. And in the Quran, they're warning them, what we're teaching you is going to lead you to a bad outcome. And people are like, I don't care, I want it. And they give it to them. And there's all kinds of interesting Islamic legends about how these two angels actually did disobey God and then are trapped on earth. And essentially to survive on earth, they trade off their secret knowledge of the occult to human beings, right? And so that's an interesting story there. So that's the origin of magic. The Quran condemns very specific kind of magic, which we would call black magic, which it refers to that the angels Harut and Marut taught people the ability to actually create problems between people, like break up a husband and wife. One of the old form of voodoo is, the voodoo doll, can you make her break up with the guy I like, right? And that's a very common kind of modern magical thing. They putting a curse on somebody or trying to disrupt people's relationships for your own benefit, right? So that it talks about that and says that that's condemned. And the general Islamic position is that any kind of magic or sorcery is condemned. However, Islam is a very mystical tradition. Like I said, I'm a Sufi, which is an Islamic mystic. And so the idea that using various incantations of God's name or using what we do consider spell, like writing various Quranic verses in special ways and, almost like numerology, will actually give you the power over things, because you're essentially going down to the energies of creation. And that sounds like magic to somebody who's like, well, but you're just happen to use the Quran to do it, but you're actually trying to change the material world. So Islam has had this much more flexible acceptance of mysticism, what we call magic, as part of our practical lives. My Sufi teachers in West Africa, they do all kinds of special blessings. I just got one in the mail. They said, here's a special thing, we're sending you this blessing from West Africa, put it in the water, take a bath with it, and and that will protect you and advance your things. That sounds like voodoo magic to somebody outside the tradition, but it is part of the Islamic culture. So because of that recognition, because we also have a belief in jinn as a reality, that these supernatural beings live amongst us and can do supernatural things in this world, that human people, I mean, it's not theoretical. Muslims believe, well, I can't find my car keys, the jinn must have taken it. It's a real thing, right? And my car keys have vanished, the jinn took it, right? I hope it returns it, right? So because of that acceptance of the supernatural and the mystical as part of our day-to-day lives in Islamic culture, we don't seem to have this thing of like Dungeons and Dragons is inherently, because I have a friend of mine, Christian friend, he took me to his church in Seattle, lovely experience there, that, he's a very devout Christian and he's an evangelical. And of course, he's trying to convert me, and that's fine. He was doing his thing. But I went in and enjoyed his church and nice people there. And afterwards, he got a little embarrassed because a woman came up to me and she wanted me to sign a petition, which was to ban Harry Potter from the local school. And he got kind of embarrassed because he's also a writer and artist, and he's also into this stuff. And he was like a little embarrassed that his fellow church members were making this big deal about this book. And he said, "It's like, well, would you ban The Wizard of Oz?" He said that to his fellow, like, because he was trying to like cover his embarrassment that she had brought this to me, and he's like, "Well, The Wizard of Oz has witches in it." She's like, "Well, we should ban that too, right?" And so that's a very specifically, I think, American evangelical phenomenon that comes out of Puritanism. This country was founded, essentially, the earliest settlements were Puritan, right? And so that will always be the foundational bedrock of our culture, is the Pilgrims and the Puritans, who had very specific ideas of magic. And if you watch the movie, have you seen the movie The Witch?
Yes.
I love that movie.
I do too. Yeah.
That explores when the American settlers are here in essentially the 1600s. This whole continent is magical. I mean, you're at night, you go to sleep, there's nobody around you for hundreds of miles except trees, and who knows what's in those woods, right? And so it leads to a belief into the supernatural. And in that movie, it turned out the supernatural is actually real, right? But you certainly come to understand why the Salem witch trials could happen in that environment, because the supernatural is this terrifying thing of a new continent where you don't know any of the rules, where there's animals you've never seen before, like turkeys that don't exist in Europe, and you don't know what else is in these woods, right? So the supernatural becomes real. So that's a uniquely American phenomenon. I don't think, Russia has a long tradition of folklore around magic and magical traditions. I think the Russian Orthodox Church doesn't really like that, but it's still part of Russian popular culture today in 2022. So the church hasn't pushed it out of the system, whereas we do have this unique phenomenon of American evangelical culture, which takes this puritanical, literally, interpretation of magic, and any way of describing fantastical stories is seen as sinful and a threat. That's very specifically American.
Let me bring this up, and then I have something direct to that. So we've got a comment here about Drow in D&D make a choice to follow Loth. In R.A. Salvador's new novel, Starlight Enclave and Glacier's Edge, half of the Drow are moving away from following the demon Loth and making a different choice. That's interesting. I know that as I was researching the orcs, they brought up, the publishers of D&D brought up not only the orcs, but also the Drow as being capable of also more choice than had previously been depicted in earlier editions.
It leads to interesting storytelling. I think choice always creates interesting storytelling, right? It's more fun to deal with complex villains than it is to deal with, black and white villains.
Well, okay, I got another thing on that as well. But let me say how we approach evil from the subject of the religious one, to tie that off. Like now, so everyone knows I'm not religious. So I talk about all these different things, and I really appreciate them. And of course, I come out of this Southern tradition of Christianity, but I myself have left that. But like, for instance, when I had the Middle Earth role-playing game as a kid, like middle school or something like that, that was in the house, it was very explicit that the orcs in that were evil. You okay?
So Heath, I've lost connection. I'm going to try to reconnect. I don't know what's happening.
Okay, I can still hear you, but definitely reconnect.
Heath, am I back yet?
I can hear you.
Okay, Heath, I think I'm back. I've just, unfortunately, the same old problems we were having. So I did not hear the last thing that you said. Okay. You were saying something, and I just didn't hear any of it. So
I was saying, as a kid, I had the Middle Earth role-playing game.
Yes.
And in it was very explicit that the orcs are evil. It was talking that they worship. I remember the phrase, they worship the darkness,
Okay.
and then this was, but they're the bad guys. And
They're your adversary. So yeah.
okay, but my father had a major problem with this. That the orcs are demonic. So this book is not allowed to be in the house.
Even though you're fighting the orcs, you're not adopting.
Right. So that was part of my point. That was like, well, within a Christian context, you can say, well, here are the orcs. They are evil. They are demonic. And the proper relationship with them is an adversary, that you are supposed to fight them as the hero. So, but nonetheless, just the presence of that in the house was get it out of here. Cannot be in this house.
I mean, and look, I said this is my grandfather. I remember this. My grandfather was a very well-educated man. He was actually like the inspector of schools in Pakistan, highly educated guy. And, he didn't like, one day I remember this. I mean, I was raised in America, went back to visit him as a kid. I remember my cousin had these books on these sort of like books written in Urdu, the language of Pakistan, about the jinn, like sort of like horror stories, like almost like kids' books, horror stories about the jinn. And, my grandfather found them, and I remember him saying he was really upset with my cousin. He said, I don't want this kind of stuff in my house, right? Because he believed they could attract and he's a well-educated, British educated guy, right? But he's like, I don't want this kind of stuff. It's bad energy. I don't want this in the house. I think conservative religious people generally dislike seeing anything that they feel can attract negative entities of their tradition. That's where the fear seems to come from. And maybe the fear is not unfounded. Maybe, there is an Islamic belief. You talk about the jinn, they hear you, and they suddenly take an interest in you, right? Yeah. And so do you really want their attention?
Yeah, I think that could definitely be a part of it. As like, for instance, Dungeons and Dragons and orcs in general and fantasy has evolved, and now they are less demonic. This is what I was talking about, humanizing the demon, because like I said, personally, I'm not religious. This is not my position, but I try to understand all these positions. If I were a conservative, Southern Christian, I'm like, which one would be worse? The book, which does present the orcs as demonic, yet your adversaries, they're what you're supposed to fight. Or like the newer kind of stuff where the orcs are, actually, they're not really all that bad. And they might even be something that you want to be. And that
for a conservative religious person, the latter is more dangerous because the idea is now you are humanizing the demons.
I see. That's what I would think.
Get suckered by them, right? That was how they would think. I would think.
I would think, but I personally haven't seen that talked about quite as much. Like the tieflings, even the tieflings in Dungeons and Dragons now extremely popular, and that's like your direct infernal ancestry. But what does infernal ancestry do for you in Dungeons and Dragons? It gives you cool eyes and some skin color and like some horns. Sure. And so I could see, as I was writing this, I was like, well, I could see how somebody would definitely take the approach here that we are humanizing the demonic. And this is actually worse than the presentation of just the demonic as something evil. I thought it was a really interesting commentary on evil in society and the way we approach this.
Well, look, I had this conversation recently with a friend of mine, Carrie Smith. I don't know if you're familiar. She's a conservative YouTuber, used to work in Hollywood, and then she was very liberal and leftist, and then she found her relationship with Jesus, and she became a Christian, and she walked away from a lot of the ideas she once espoused, leftist political philosophy, and she's a big critic of it. But she has this wonderful channel where she talks about her. She has all kinds of guests on there, and like, I'm a Muslim guy, she's a Christian, and I'm always invited on there. But we had a very interesting conversation recently, where she said, because in her new belief system, she believes morality is objective and that it's universal. And I said, okay, I think to a large degree that's true. I think most of us would agree that murder in pretty much every culture is not good, incest, these kinds of things. Pretty much every culture has taboos on these things. But let's go a little deeper. And I hit the thing that I knew might startle her, which it did. It led to a very intense conversation between us because she had always thought I believed everything she believed, right? And I'm like, well, actually, I'm not actually a Christian. I am a Muslim. I'm a different tradition, right? So I said,
she didn't know that?
Well, no, she knew that, but
Oh, okay.
in our conversation, because we were always talking about critiquing sort of modern, where the social culture had gotten to, as fellow believers in the Abrahamic tradition, but we never had an inter-Abrahamic discussion, right? Of differences in practices. So I hit her on the issue of, so is polygamy immoral? Certainly, most Christians, nearly all Christians would say it is, and that monogamy is the only God-given moral relationship.
I
That
might
is
have
that
heard
is
this conversation.
Yeah, and I said, well, that's certainly the point of view. Certainly, that's the official stance of Europe and America, and that we are Christian origin countries, right? But polygamy exists and has existed historically throughout the world. Exists today. My friends in West Africa are polygamists. I've been there. I've lived in their home with their 3 wives. They're very happy people. The kids are doing great. The wives get along really well and take care of each other's children, right? So is polygamy immoral? It's not common in the Muslim world anymore, but it still exists. And I I wrote, and she got very startled by that. And I wouldn't project on her she got uncomfortable, because I think she's more open than that. But it led to a very heated discussion, because her stance is, well, it's clear to me polygamy is immoral from the Bible. I said, well, Abraham was polygamous, and Moses was polygamous. Jacob, the 12 sons of Israel, came from like 4 different wives, right? And they're the foundation of the chosen people within Judaism and in Christianity, right? So I was like, there's no indication in the Old Testament of the Hebrew Bible, none, that polygamy is immoral, none whatsoever. It's a standard practice of the Middle East. What the origin of monogamy is interesting, because it is something the Roman Empire imposed as a means of organizing their empire, where men had one official wife that was recognized by the Roman law, and those children would be legitimate. But men were also had children through slaves, they had mistresses, and those children were illegitimate under Roman law. They did not have property rights. It was a way of controlling property rights. And then Christianity, as it evolved inside of the Roman Empire, wasn't out there monogamy was the norm when Christianity is spreading in Rome, in Turkey, in North Africa, all Roman Empire, right? In Europe, monogamy was the cultural norm, because the Romans had imposed that for several hundred years. It wasn't the norm in the ancient Middle East, but in the areas of Christianity developed, it was the norm. So nobody even questioned that. Of course, Jesus, I'm sure, would have supported monogamy. It's not clear at all, because first century Jews were polygamous. The disciples may have been polygamous. It was just the norm there. Monogamy was not the norm in Jesus' time, in his environment. So this led to a very intense discussion between us. And ultimately, there was no resolution, because as a devout Christian, she said, well, then Abraham was immoral. Moses was immoral. I said, well, okay. But, God told Abraham, he ended, don't do child sacrifice, don't worship idols. He was very clear about the things not to do. He never told him you can't have more than one wife. He had Hagar, he had Sarah, he had other wives. Moses had at least 2 wives that we know of. Moses was told, don't worship idols. Here's your 10 commandments. Not one of those commandments is monogamous, right? He could have said be monogamous. And this got her very, she was quite startled by this, because it was a shaking of this black and white worldview about universal morality on a certain level. And, I think it really startled her, because it was a perspective. To her, polygamy is evil. It is satanic. To me, it's one form of human organization that, in my religion, God has permitted under certain restrictions, and that's not immoral to me. So, and here we are, 2 Westerners, and this was the first time she's like, oh my God, I don't think I've ever disagreed with you before, but I disagree with you on this. And it was a fundamental disagreement about the morality of a practice that exists on a substantial portion of the planet. It can't be resolved, because it comes out of 2 philosophical backgrounds that have this presumption and so it's nothing to question. It's either immoral or moral. And if it's immoral, then Abraham was immoral, and all the biblical prophets were immoral, and you needed Jesus to come and clean it up. That's her perspective, right? From the Islamic perspective, well, this was all normal. It's you, the guys, that put a restriction on something that was always happening. And that's not something that Jesus taught from an Islamic perspective. We couldn't resolve it. So from her point of view, my perspective on that issue is evil. And I said to her, okay, but and I try to get, in most societies, certainly in America, the demographic is 51% female, 49% male, just the demographic of society. So you have a 2% larger number of females. In America, there's 250 million people. So that means there are about 7 million more women than men in America. So in a purely monogamous world, those 7 million women don't get husbands. And what do? Like in Europe, solved that by creating monasteries and nuns. They will go become a nun, right? And is that the right solution? That's one solution. Another solution is that, they can have one husband has multiple wives, and then that 7 million suddenly has a partner, right? That's another social solution. But we couldn't get past it. She saw it as evil, and I saw that 7 million women can't get married. I saw that as evil. How do you resolve that? You can't.
Right. Okay, I have got a perspective on Satan that you may have never heard before that I want to bring up to you, because
Please.
I've been very interested in angels, Lucifer, Satan, because the world that the worlds I'm going to be writing after the rabbits that you see back here deals with the fall of Lucifer. So I'm actually actively involved in using Christian mythology as a background for fantasy.
And it's good that you're using rabbits because the Eastern mythology connects us, to rabbits, and so it's interesting.
Rabbits first, then angels and jinn. That's where I'm going.
Okay.
But so I was studying angels and jinn and demons, and so I was trying to ask as many different people, had with some degree of authority on these, particularly regarding free will, of whether or not the angels have free will. My father is an Anglican priest, and my grandfather is a Southern Baptist minister. And so
Your father was already a rebel. Your father's already a rebel going against grandpa on that.
Right. Yeah, I know. It's kind of weird that he's very liturgical Anglican. He had come out of the Episcopal Church. And of course, obviously, he attended Southern Baptist Church as a kid. But then my mother's family was always Episcopal. So I guess that's why he joined that when he married my mother.
Which is because that's one would call that a more progressive kind of Christianity than, it's a very liberal kind. I mean, Catholics, conservative Catholics, I don't know about these Anglicans, man.
Well, yes, and this is a side point from what I was about to make.
Yes, well, but let's go back to the main point. Yes.
Yeah, the Episcopal Church is a very liberal church, but the Anglican Church, my father split from the Episcopal Church because he wanted to be more conservative, and so he's from.
So there's still an Anglican conservative movement. I know in Britain there definitely is, but even then, Britain has been moving. The Anglicans have been moving more towards Episcopal liberalism, but that's a whole other conversation.
Right. Yeah.
The nature of evil.
Okay, so what? So I asked my father, do the angels have free will? Mm-hmm. And he immediately answered, no, they do not. And so I wanted to know, okay, well then how did Lucifer fall? Mm-hmm. And then he was like, he immediately backtracked on that because he didn't want a situation where God would make something like, create evil, right? So he backtracked on that, and that maybe the angels do.
Although the Bible is actually very clear, I believe it's in Isaiah where God is quoted as saying that I create evil. I mean, he says it in the Bible, but that's a whole other conversation.
Well, but then I asked my Southern Baptist minister grandfather, do the angels have free will? And he also said no. Okay. And I asked him, directly. And so I asked him, well, then how did Lucifer fall? And he didn't backtrack on, oh, well, maybe he does have free will. He said something I've never heard before. He said it was because Lucifer was the creative angel, and he used his creativity to bring evil into the world. And
that's a very interesting, a little troubling, I think, that interpretation.
Well, a little troubling, but it completely shocked me, and it sticks with me today. Because he's rural Alabama. My grandfather, so growing up in a different time, and if you think about the time of that rural Alabama out in the country, what should you be doing as a man? Let's say, is it writing a poem or a play or something like that? Of course not. They want how much wood did you chop? There is
you got to be practical.
Fields to
you got to survive.
Right. And so it from that cultural perspective, when he said that, like literally and directly associating the satanic with the creative, I was like, oh my God, that makes sense from a cultural perspective.
Well, it makes sense. And again, it comes from, modern evangelicism is a evolution from Puritanism, even though one would argue it's not a direct root, but that it comes out of that thing. And the Puritans wouldn't dance. They would
not be big on creativity. Right.
Yeah, and again, they were survival mode. They were in this new continent trying to survive. And they thought anything as a distraction from that was literally life or death.
Stunt Brat says that is it possible the angels have used free will, but after the fall they made a final decision? That was my father's opinion, that the angels made a free, that when they fell they made a choice, and that unlike humans, which can oscillate and come back and be redeemed, that once the angel fell, that decision was eternal. That's what creates a demon and the demonic. That was an eternal choice.
So let me now bring in the difference in the story of Islam of the origin of Satan. It's a similar but not same story. Okay, so scholars of Christianity will recognize parts of the story. It's very similar to early Christian texts that were not incorporated into the Bible, but we found the 2nd and 3rd century texts that have a very similar story in Christian writings. So the Islamic story is that when God created Adam, he ordered the angels to bow down to Adam and acknowledge that Adam is superior to them, because essentially Adam has free will and they do not, right? And he has a body and they do not. They're made of energy. And this is the interesting thing. The Quran says they all bow down except for Iblis. So Iblis is the figure that would become Satan. His name is interesting because it literally in Arabic means he that despairs. That's what it means. It means the person that so despair is the sin, is that he doesn't believe God can forgive him, so he despairs of it. So Iblis refuses to do so. And in a later part of the Quran, or in a different part of the Quran, it's not later, it's not a linear book, but in a different part of the Quran, Iblis is identified as a jinn and not an angel. And there's all kinds of stories that he was like the king of the jinn, and because of that status, he was allowed to be as high as the angels, and so he was amongst them when the command came, and the angels automatically obeyed because they're robotic, right? Whereas Iblis, who had the jinn's free will, refused to do so, and God asked him, "Why are you not bowing?" And the response is, "Because I'm better than him. You made him of mud, of earth, and you made me," of the Islamic tradition is the jinn is created of smokeless fire. The angels are created of light, and then the jinn are created of essentially of plasma, right? Something that's partly material, partly energetic. Angels are pure energy. So they're in between human and angel, right? So they are made of smokeless fire. And he said, "You made me a fire." So it's like the first sin is actually racism. I'm better than him because of my ontological, you made me better in the way I look, in my essence. And that's not for him to make that judgment, but he did. And so God says, "Well, get out. It's not for you to show pride here in paradise. You don't, if you're going to question me, get out." And then, Iblis realizes that he's essentially condemned himself to hell, and that's why he despairs. But he's too proud to change his mind on that and say, "You know what, I'm going to bow down." He says, "All right, can you give me some time? Don't throw me in hell right now. Give me some time." He said he asked for time. He asked for respite. And God says, "All right, you have time." He says, "Now I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do with the time you just gave me." So he's like a trick, right? You gave me some time. You showed me your mercy. You didn't throw me in hell immediately for disobeying you. Now I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do with my time that you gave me. I'm going to tempt these human beings. I'm going to whisper into their ear. So they're called the whisperers of jinn. I'm going to put ideas in their minds, raise lust in them, anger, aggression. They will kill each other, will commit abominations in this earth. And then you will see that I was right and that they are inferior to me, right? Because I'm not going to do anything to them. I'm just going to put the idea in their head, and they're going to freely do it of their own free will, right? And you will see how bad they are. And God says, "All right, do that, and anyone who follows you will be in hell with you." So that's the story, right? So now already that's a different story, because now he's a jinn and not an angel. He has free will, and he's actually playing a game with God. He's manipulated the situation of getting a respite to say, "Now I'm going to use the time you gave me to screw with these guys," right? The other difference with the traditional Christian understanding of demons and Satan as understood, because he's called Satan in the Quran, he's Shaitan, I mean, that's the name, is that especially in the Catholic tradition, Satan can be seen as a very powerful adversary. Like we watch The Exorcist, right? It's a terrifying movie. He ends up killing 2 priests. They despite all the power of Christ compels you, it doesn't listen, right? And it doesn't they don't seem to have power over it. Whereas and my friends who are conservative Catholics, I even know a Catholic exorcist, he's really afraid of these things because, he thinks that they are so powerful that even the word of God that he believes in may not be enough to stop them if I don't have this faith that's strong enough, right? In Islam, the Quran says Satan is weak. He's weak. His only power is to whisper ideas into your head, and you can just ignore him. And you can invoke God, remember God, and he goes away like a shadow when you point a light to it, right? Tolkien uses the shadow so much, right? So that's a major difference. In Islam, he's weak in that the moment you invoke God, the angels come and push him away. So he doesn't have, even though there's stories of possession, all these things, the Islamic thing is, well, he's not that powerful. And if you bring any kind of faith, you immediately drive him out, right? So that's a different perspective on the nature of evil. It's seen as this weak shadow that is easily driven away.
That is interesting.
Right? Whereas my Catholic friends think it's this constant battle, Lucifer versus Michael, and it's this intense battle. It's not seen that way in Islam because he's just a tempter. He has no power beyond that. So that is the major difference in the two traditions that have a Satan story, right? And that then affects your concept of evil. Is that, in the Christian tradition, because evil is this incredible force that's like this, almost like a black hole that can suck everything in, right? It's so dangerous. In the Christian tradition, you have Christ, God becomes man, and literally does a blood sacrifice, essentially to nullify the power of that, right? Because it's so powerful. And in Islam, we don't have vicarious atonement. We have Jesus is a huge prophet of Islam, but one of the other major differences is the Quran. In the Quran, Jesus is not crucified. He appears to be, so everyone around him thinks they're seeing the crucifixion, but that's not what happens. It's actually an illusion of some kind. And Jesus is completely unharmed in the process because he's God's prophet and God would never do this horrible thing to him. And the reason that story is different is that you don't need Jesus to die on the cross. You don't need him to die because his death doesn't make any difference because there's no vicarious atonement, because evil is so weak, it doesn't need this cosmic event. It just doesn't need it. It's easily driven away. Those are the differences in doctrine that come out of it. And as a result, maybe that's one of the reasons that Muslims have not been that afraid of Dungeons and Dragons and fantasy stories, because evil is seen as inherently weak. So it shouldn't have any more power over you than you give it. Whereas you're coming out of Christian tradition, the very presence of the Dungeons and Dragons book or the toys, whatever, in your house invites this incredible force of danger into your life. That's a different perspective.
That's really interesting. That's really interesting. I knew you were the exact person to have this conversation with. I knew this. All right, we just have a few.
Now I understand. Just talking to you, I now understand the difference because I didn't understand it before what you were saying. Now I do.
That's incredible. Okay, we have just a few minutes left, but I want to bring this back around to storytelling.
Yes, please.
And to another point that you had brought up when we talked about, well, are gray bad guys inherently more interesting? Because we have, I would say, as culture, as the way we're dealing with evil now, it's very popular now to have gray bad guys, George R. Martin style stuff.
Well, he's probably his good guys are gray. That's what George R. Martin. Everyone's gray, right?
Everyone's gray, right? Yeah, exactly. And I love that kind of storytelling too. But then, do we always have to have well-rounded characters? Are we missing something from modern storytelling by saying, no, your bad guy can't be evil? Is that preventing us from grappling something with the demonic? And are we losing something? Can we tell just as interesting stories if we're dealing with the demonic as the bad guy? We're talking about in the
So I'll give an example from the Islamic tradition and then the Sufi mystical tradition, right, which I'm part of, right? So the archetype of evil amongst human beings in Islam is the Pharaoh of Moses. He's the archetype. He is considered the example of, pride, arrogance, cruelty, disbelief, all of these things that are the things that Satan promised he's going to show in human beings, this figure. No matter how many miracles God does, Moses does, it doesn't sway him, right? And so he's the archetype of villainy. And the Pharaoh, you're actually interesting. If you look at during the Iranian Revolution, the Iranians have just like to China, the CCP had these incredible posters for revolution. The Iranians, who are a very artistic culture, created these incredible pro-revolution posters in 79 and 80, right? And one of the most vivid ones I remember is one of the Shah of Iran as the Pharaoh. Like he's the Pharaoh, and he's falling on his knees before Ayatollah Khomeini, who is essentially standing there holding the 10 Commandments over him, right? That's the archetype, because Pharaoh is the ultimate evil and the Shah is the ultimate evil, right? So here's the interesting thing. So that's a standard, very, ask any Muslim, Pharaoh is evil and irredeemable. All right. However, Rumi, the great Sufi poet, which we may have heard of, is most popular poet in America today. Rumi is the great Sufi poet of 13th century Turkey, and he wrote this incredible multi-volume epic called the Masnavi, which is sort of his like Odyssey, where he puts all of his spiritual teachings into this incredible, multi-volume, poetic epic. And so he has a story, and I shared this with a friend of mine who's Turkish, and she was so startled. She's like, I can't be there. Prove it to me. And I gave her the actual quatrains to go look. And she's like, oh my God, the story is there. So this is a story. So Rumi took that as a mystic. And the story, he says, what if this is what really happened? What really happened is Pharaoh actually is a devout believer in God. He believes in God. He believes in the God of Moses. So when Moses shows up, Pharaoh's like, yeah, this guy really is a prophet of God. I'm going to let his people go. And I'm just going to worship this one God, right? And then in the story, he has a private moment where he's praying to God. It's like, thank you, I found you. Thank you for sending me Moses. And God says through an angel, it's like, no. You can't do that in public. In public, I need you to play this role of the villain because the story isn't going to work. Moses can't do this and be this great story that we're going to talk about for thousands of years, right? Unless he's got this adversary that's going to resist him, and no matter what is thrown at him, he comes at it. You got to play that role. And Pharaoh's like, I don't want to play that role. I believe in you. But if I play this role, I'm going to be this hated villain throughout history, but I believe in you. I don't want the job. And God says, God says to him, this is sort of like an intimate thing between lovers. You and I know the truth. You and I know the truth. It's like our wedding night. I know you believe in me. You know you believe in me. I need you to play this role because the story won't work if everyone finds out you believe in me. And so when he's drowning the Red Sea in that story, he's actually a martyr because he's played the role God ordered him to play. He didn't want to do it, and he's accepted death as the martyrdom. This is similar in some ways to the Gospel of Judas, which was one of these non-canonical Gospels and from the 2nd century that stated that Jesus told Judas go do it. And Judas was like, I don't want to do it. I don't want to betray you. And Jesus like, no, you got to play the role and you got to play the villain, right? There's a reason this strand exists in our religions because suddenly Pharaoh's really interesting, right? Suddenly Pharaoh's really interesting because now he's like a tortured guy who's playing a role he doesn't want to play, who wants to be able to publicly believe in God, but he can't because God has told him not to. Now he's really compelling. Same thing with Judas. Judas is like, I don't want to betray you to the Romans. I won't do it. And Jesus is like, you got to go do it. And you're going to be the villain of the story. But you and I will know that's not true, even though nobody else will. That's the story in the Gospel of Judas. Suddenly the character is really interesting. As a storyteller, the character is really interesting now. So yes, gray characters will always be more interesting and more insightful about the human condition than black and white characters are. Even though black and white characters are easier to draw and have the longest cultural effect. I mean, the average Muslim has never heard that story from Rumi where Pharaoh is not the villain. And he wouldn't believe it if he did, like my friend didn't believe it, right? And because the popular archetype is Pharaoh is the ultimate example. He's like Hitler. He's the ultimate example of evil. And that's the version that's going to work for most people. But as a storyteller, you're always drawn to that more subtle version. It's just natural.
That is a very interesting take. That's a very interesting
You didn't expect
take.
to go there, but that's where it went.
I don't know where I expected it to go. I don't know where I expected it to go. I was going to say something about when you're dealing with black and white, or you're dealing with something like that, it's very easy to therefore have those characters be in conflict with each other. And what you're actually doing is, even though you're manifesting different aspects, you're actually having an internal dialogue, but externally, because you've got different characters who, are always bringing things to.
Well, but even let's say we take the black and white character that is irredeemable. Satan, Morgoth, right? Yeah. Morgoth and the Tolkien things. He's an irredeemable bad guy. So is Sauron, right? They don't ever have any moment of conscience, right? But from a storyteller's point of view, it's just like Milton wrote in Paradise Lost, right? Story doesn't work without Satan. It just doesn't work. You need, without the adversary, there's no story. It's like what God says Pharaoh in Rumi's thing, right? There's no story. You need the adversary. The most important character is the villain of the story. Star Wars is meaningless without Darth Vader. It's meaningless. There's no story. You don't care about Luke Skywalker or the princess or anybody else without Darth Vader. You just don't care, right? And so the hero of the story is arguably the villain, because without it, there is no story. And the villain is like, one way to think of evil, and the villain is like when you go to the gym. The villain is the bar. and you got to lift that bar, and it's making you stronger, and it's fighting you, it's resisting you, and if it's too much weight, it will hurt you or crush you, right? It could damage or even kill you if you put too much weight on that bar, if you're taking on something you're not ready to take on, right? And so, but is the bar evil? It's your obstacle without which you cannot become stronger. The bar is necessary. In a world of duality, the bar is a good thing. It will make you stronger. So that's one way to look at evil.
Well, I knew that you were the right person to talk to about this because I had gotten into my study of orcish to that idea of am I talking about or am I documenting the
Mhm.
humanization of the demonic? What does that mean for storytelling? What does that mean for what we're doing as society, our understanding of evil as society? So I think there's a lot there. I think this extended and advanced the discussion greatly, and I think it's probably something people don't see elsewhere on YouTube.
It's
So
not. I'm going to tell more of my friends on social media to go back and watch this video.
and they would watch
because
this
I think
video.
there's
I'm
a
going to send this to
conversation I've
people
never
to watch
had.
this. Right. This
Yeah.
is an important discussion. You are the person I wanted to have it with. So if
Mhm.
you are here, please do like and subscribe.
Please
Because
do.
let me tell you, on this channel, we are talking about creating things. We are in the midst of creating, whether it's games, stories, web shows, action figures, plush toys. We're all creating that here.
Mhm.
And we have a thank you here, a provoking and great dialogue. Exactly. We need to share this around and get this out here.
Yeah, please
On
forward it.
this
I'm going
channel,
to forward it around. I think
yeah,
this is the most compelling thing I've talked about on a philosophical level in the time I've been on YouTube. And not a
well,
lot
I
of people
really
see it so
appreciate
far.
that.
Hopefully more will see it when we get it out.
Yeah, I hope so. I'm going to promote it because we need more of this. And also on this channel, you're going to hear from
Mhm.
the director of the stories that we're doing, the co-writers, the directors of photography. We're on General Geekdom on Sundays, our costumers. So if you're on this channel, you are going to be dealing with people who are down in the trenches, myself included, trying to make stuff. So we don't do like just critique of the latest trailer stuff on this channel. We are all trying to make stuff happen in board games, stories, action figures, toys. We're making it happen here.
And your channel is great. It's your channel. I'm gonna, as a Muslim who does not drink, I'm gonna suggest your channel is like fine wine, right? Fine wine. It is something that your people go back and who haven't seen it when it was originally broadcast and are watching it. These conversations, like the one we had today, I think are going to age very nicely and are going to stick with people. They're more than like the review of the movie of the week. That's what I've seen of your channel. So it will continue to age well and be of value to people years from now when they go back and watch these videos.
That is exactly what I'm trying to do. And I actually put the link to the playlist for this show, Table Talk, and then also General Geekdom down below, because, yeah, we don't do review of the week. We've talked about masculinity, the
Mhm.
feminine. We've talked about horror. We've talked about different aspects of storytelling. So go back to those playlists if you're looking for something to watch. Also, the show Dinner and a Board Game, The Cultists, is our show that is their comedy web show. That season 2 is coming out. So yes, a lot of what is on this channel, please do go back, dig into other videos because it's not review of the week. You'll dig in and it'll still be as relevant as it was when it was recorded. All right, go to Cameron's Patreon. That's the
Yeah,
primary
we'll
place
throw a
to be
link
able
in
to
there.
go.
We'll throw a link
Yes,
in there.
the link is down below.
Okay, great. So I have my Patreon is something I'm very proud of. That's Heath and I. He's a member of my Patreon, and I talk a lot more, not as archetypally, but I do talk a lot about Hollywood stuff that's happening and give insights like today, what's been happening with Matt Reeves and getting an extended deal at Warner Brothers after a day after they canceled his Batman animated show. So I talk about what that actually means for the internal politics of Bad Robot and J.J. Abrams, his mentor. Insight that I don't think a lot of people are getting on YouTube or anywhere else. I'm as an actual working writer in Hollywood. This is actually still what I do. My day job. That's what I do. I try to bring those years of experience into the industry of how this very strange industry works. And so I hope you'll join me on the Patreon. This also is a way for, there's, like I said, I offer consulting service on there if you've got a screenplay or a book, whatever. And, Heath knows I consult with people and get them general advice. And so you can contact me through the Patreon to set those up.
And yeah, he does Patreon right. I had one years ago. We closed it down. People have asked me if I'm going to start a new one. I'm not ready yet, but I tried one. It failed. Cameron's actually doing it right. He's got a great community as far as Patreon goes.
Yeah, and it's a live community, and I try to post something every day. And I've got a couple of Patreon subscriptions. I'm like, hey, I'm paying like money. Where's my article? And like one a month will come. I'm like, no, I don't. That's not what I'm paying for, right?
Okay, I'm going to close this out with my trailer for Terra Tiles, which that launched today on GameFound. The link is below. If you're in the tabletop game industry, then Terra Tiles is my modular hexagonal terrain system for Dungeons and Dragons or any other games you want to play. I didn't want to interrupt our conversation in the middle of it and play it. So I'm going to play it right here at the end, and then we will close out. So bye, everybody. Terra Tiles are the easiest way to get great-looking terrain on your table. They are bright and colorful and ready to play right out of the box. There's nothing to print, paint, or assemble, and Terra Tiles is on GameFound right now. The campaign has opened with road and stream sets on a beautiful green battlefield, as well as road and desert oasis sets in a desert environment. Terra Tiles are large, thick, and durable, being 9 inches from point to point. That's large enough to make setting them up quick and easy, while also being the perfect size to create really varied and organic-looking terrain setups for your table. Terra Tiles come in 2 varieties, without a grid and with a hex grid, for all of those games where grids make movement easier. Each hex on the grid is 1.5 inches from point to point, making them perfect for 25 or 28mm miniatures for any miniature game. The gridded Terra Tiles also have a wet and dry erase marker-safe coating, so you can annotate and mark them up during the game. Terra Tiles has a great gaming community around the terrain setups, so click the link below to head over to the GameFound page and make a pledge today. Whoa. All right, bye everybody. See you later. See you on GameFound for Terra Tiles, and see you back here on YouTube. Later.